So, what is real? A complex systems view of ontology. So, what I'm interested in exploring in this short presentation is what implications are there for our knowledge and understanding of the world as a result of viewing things as complex systems? Um, what implications does it have for our simulations? What implications does it have for us, for our ability to generate knowledge about the real world and generate knowledge in such a way as we can interact with the world to achieve certain outcomes? And complex systems view really does complicate this relationship between the real and our ability to understand it. So, what is it about complexity that makes knowing about the world so troublesome? Well, one way to view this is looking at causality. So, causality is very often kind of viewed in a fairly linear fashion. You know, X impacts Y impacts Z. It's a very simple linear view of causality. It also assumes that what we've not only got X, affecting Y, affecting Z. It also assumes that actually identifying X, Y, and Z is a fairly trivial exercise. It's sometimes referred to as naive positivism in philosophical circles, where we assume that what we see is what there is, and that you know what we see through our filters that help us identify objects and different objects and the boundaries of objects is a fairly straightforward process. We can trust our eyes, build models, and all is good in the world. Um, and a lot of science is done this way. In some ways, it's almost miraculous that science has managed to do so much by generally assuming that objects are coherent and real, that the causality between them is fairly straightforward. Um, it also making these assumptions also yields mathematics which can be solved analytically in a fairly trivial way. I mean, it may not be trivial for everybody, but the mathematics has some nice rules. There's all kinds of tools, and when you make certain assumptions about the world and convert it into a certain type of mathematics, it is a relatively straightforward exercise to solve that problem. So on the complex system side, we have a very different view of things. Causality is the result of or comprised of many interacting feedback loops. And these interactions tend to be nonlinear. So instead of X, Y, Z, we have many more interactions going on. We have many more objects, and they're not only interacting with each other, but those interactions come back to feed upon themselves. And it's this nonlinear feedback, or at least not just the feedback itself, but the number of loops and the fact they are nonlinear and feedback that creates a real challenge for us. So it also recognizes that our X, Y, and Z. I mean, these objects of our interest. It's very much dependent on the filter we choose, and those filters take us away from reality in a sense. They are a way of carving out part of reality and saying, okay, I'm interested in this, um, but why? It's our filters, our predispositions, our tools, which lead us towards looking at certain objects as objects, rather than trying to take, the universe, if you like, on its own terms. So, the frustrating thing with as soon as we start having some non-linearity in the problem and a bit of feedback is the mathematics doesn't work anymore. The number of non-linear systems that are analytically solvable, essentially trivial, is very small. It's and on the other hand, it's very, very easy to make up nonlinear systems, very simple nonlinear systems that are impossible to solve analytically. It's incredibly simple to do that. It's it's one of those things we don't kind of learn so much at school. Is we get taught all of this mathematics and all of this science, but they're not very good at telling us the limitations of those tools and the assumptions that had to be made to make those tools useful in the sense that they are. Um, Part of the reaction to this um, over the years, I mean, obviously computation's played a big part in this. Experiments in computation is what a guy, Steve Bankers at Rand, was talking about in the late 90s. And he went as far as to say that the the difficulty in even drawing a picture of the problem we're trying to understand is such that the models are essentially worthless in as far as they are accurate representations of reality or the system of interest. But the process of going through modeling, you learn an awful lot about the problem itself, the space that you're interested in. So it's the process of modeling that's valuable, not the model at the end. The model at the end is, it's very limited in its applicability. Its jurisdiction is very limited, and in many cases, you could go as far as to say it's pretty damn useless. But the knowledge you picked up along the way to build even a useless model is kind of very valuable in trying to understand such systems. We also saw, in the early 70s, as a response to the kind of very linear systems engineering approaches of the time, soft systems methodologies. We've now got critical systems heuristics, other multi-methodology approaches that really do take this idea that even drawing a picture of the system itself is problematic. It's not trivial. You can't write down the mathematics of them, and coming up with a nice simple model you can solve is essentially futile. And so you need these more nuanced methodologies to try and extract knowledge from the system or your interaction with the system. So let's have a little look to kind of say what I'm talking about here with the three body problem. So, everybody knows the simple equation for gravity. So in a simple system, we have the Earth going around the moon. We have one feedback loop. We have the Earth affecting the moon, affecting the Earth. Um, and we have the universal law of gravitation. This particular problem is trivial to solve. Newton did this over 300 years ago. This is a very simple system to solve. Once we develop calculus, of course, but we end up with ellipses. In this case, the moon's much smaller than the Earth, so the Earth is kind of rotating around the center, kind of wobbling, and the moon's going around it. And very easy to do the math on this. Of course, I'm being a little bit simplistic. To make it trivial, you've got to assume the Earth and the Moon are perfect spheres, which of course they're not. So, in the real world, even though we've solved this analytically, the solution is imperfect because we haven't taken into account the oblateness of the Earth, for example. And if we were to do it properly, we would realise that that our model would run out, would make inaccurate predictions fairly soon in cosmological terms, and we would have to recalculate. But on the whole, this is if we just stick with the gravitational law, perfect spheres, Earth-Moon system is a trivial system to analyze. As soon as we go to a multi-body problem, so just three bodies. I mean, this isn't a large increase in complexity at all. Again, let's assume perfect spheres, and there's gravitational force between all three. Now we have four feedback loops immediately. So straight away, we've got four non-linearly interacting feedback loops. And, I think many people are, aware of the concept of chaos and the difficulties that the growth of small errors in your initial conditions and how they can grow once you've got non-linear feedback of a certain sort. So this still incredibly simple system, and yet there's no analytical solution to this anymore. There are ways to linearize it. There are ways to constrain the problem so we can come up with an analytical solution, but there isn't a general analytical solution to this problem. And all we've done is throw one more body into the equation. But this just illustrates how quickly our ability to take an analytical approach to problems is beyond our grasp very quickly, just from 2 to 3 body system. And in this particular system, if we did our exploration in computation and went through and tried many initial conditions, changed the sizes of our A, B, and C bodies, we would find that this system isn't just got chaotic modes. It has many different modes of operation. Some of them where it looks like very stable, and it might be stable for hundreds of years, even billions of years. But eventually it will switch over into another mode or attractor in the language of nonlinear dynamics, and the behavior will change significantly, as we say, qualitatively. So this simple system has already gone from our simple elliptical orbits to something that is very complicated, lots of different modes of behavior, and it can't be predicted upfront with simple analytical approaches. And here's just a little picture of showing how that would work. So, I know we choose different initial conditions to make it behave a little bit more regularly. But we've gone from a nice simple elliptical orbit to a bit of a mess. Of course, this is rerunning time and time again from the same initial conditions, and we could easily find the attractor for this particular state. But that is very much being driven by the initial conditions. And what we would find if we did a thorough analysis is there are many different types of attractors dependent on the initial conditions, and the behavior really is very rich indeed. So let's just jump over a little bit to network. So the 3-body problem we don't tend to think of as a network problem, even though in the previous slide I kind of showed you the causal feedback loops that are in the 3-body problem, and you determine those really just by putting the 3 bodies down, drawing lines between them, and then counting up the number of feedback loops in that system. So it really is just a network, even if it is a dynamic, even if the positions are dynamic. So here we have another network here. This starts off with a simple network where each node is connected to its neighbors, and then we throw in randomly a few other connections across, between more distant neighbors. And this is a fairly simple algorithm for calculating, for building small world networks. The top is one view of that small world network. The bottom picture is exactly the same network, but drawn slightly differently. This is drawn by putting all the nodes on a grid, joining them all up, summing all the distances, and then redrawing it. I think it was about 1 million times, and finding the representation where the total distances was the least. So it's a kind of optimized view, which shows how how close and far nodes are from each other. If they're far away, there's fewer connections between them. So in this particular example, we have 25 nodes. Again, well, you would think a trivially small network. I mean, how hard could it be to work with 25 nodes? We have 75 connections. Still, not too much. But these combined give us 2,345 feedback loops. If we sit through and calculate all of them, identify all of them, that's how many we've got here. So we've got an incredibly simple network that has an enormous number of feedback loops. And if you remember, just back on the previous slide with the 3-body problem, how quickly we ran into trouble with 4 feedback loops. Now we have 2,345 feedback loops. I mean, what chance do we have of untangling this mess generating knowledge and understanding of the behavior of this network, given that we can't even handle 4 feedback loops in any complete sense. So this is the real challenge of complexity, is these enormous numbers of nonlinear feedback loops, and trying to unpick that causality and to pull out patterns and rules that enable us to interact with these things in a kind of semi-predictable way. This particular network, this is a Boolean network, and we'll come to those again in another presentation. But so there are rules for each one of these nodes on how it processes the information from the incoming connections. And for this particular one, this has 20 attractors, which essentially means that if you run it from all possible initial conditions, there are 20 different end states that this network will evolve to or emerge into. So it's got 20 solutions, and not a single one of them can be determined through analysis. This is, you have to run the thing. There's no shortcuts to determining what these 20 attractors are. You have to run it, and then you find out. Hence, obviously, it's no surprise that it is computers that have given us the ability to delve deeper into these sorts of problems and start to develop maths way beyond the kind of non-linear, way beyond, sorry, the traditional linear analytical approaches that we've relied upon for so long, which are only really good for a very small subset of problems. So here we say here, so there's no comprehensive analytical methodology that will untangle the net effect of the large number of nonlinear interacting feedback loops. It's just totally beyond us, and probably always will be. So what can we do in the meantime? Here's another example, and this is for me just astonishing that this can happen in such a trivial system, and it helps us try to understand the relationship between the objects of our analysis and the real world itself, and then that gives us an idea of what are the limits and constraints on our models, which may then give us some insights in how best to use our models, given that they are, good to poor representations of what we're actually trying to model. They certainly aren't accurate representations at all. So this is a network called cellular automata, or a Boolean network. So what we have here, the top row here, each column is the state of a particular node. Each node is connected to either of its neighbors on either side, and there is a rule that tells each particular node what their state will be on the next time step forward, which is the next row, based upon its incoming connections. So this is the rule here. So for this particular network here, if I'm a node and to the left the neighbor is on, I'm currently off, and to the other side that neighbor is also off, that my value in the next time step will be 1 or on. So, and we see here, this is how the state, each row is the complete state of this network, and it shows you how this evolves through time. So here we have a system. It's a nonlinear Boolean network. Here is the rule that dictates everything. This is everything you need to know about how this system works. This is 100% complete. If we had a theory of everything, which I don't think we'll ever have, and I don't know if we'll talk about it here, but it does come out of the complex systems and nonlinear dynamics view of the world. But if we did, this is it for this particular system, and all we do is iterate these rules through time, and that defines everything. So we can see here that we start to see patterns. It's kind of interesting. It's not random. We get kind of triangular patterns over here, a bigger triangle here. It looks like there's something going on the diagonal here, but this area here, there seems to be some recurring pattern in the evolution of this system as we're going forward. So one thing we can do is to say, okay, well let's build a little transducer that processes this whole this whole diagram, remember this is the state of the system moving forward in time. It processes all of that and just takes out this background pattern. It's got a basis pattern. We take that out and we see what we've got left. And if we do that, for this particular case, this is what we get. Well, this is fairly interesting. We seem to have patterns here that are persistent over time. It's definitely not random. It seems like there's an interaction going on. We can see here we have this diagonal coming in, something happens here, one diagonal comes out. I mean, there seems to be some interaction going on here. But remember, all we've got, if we go back up, oops, okay, well, we won't go back. So if we look at this pattern, we can come up with some rules. So for example, the one I indicated over here, this is a gamma plus meeting a gamma minus and generating a beta. The beta up here, so this is this one here, the beta on the next row down here hits a gamma plus and a gamma minus comes out. So this is pretty amazing. I mean, we've got a description of the patterns in the previous diagram that seem to follow some fairly fixed rules. And we might even say, we've moved a level up from the physics, and this is a chemistry view of this particular system. So it's worth taking some time to kind of absorb what's going on here. We've got this simple physics, noughts and ones. We have a grid of, I think it's a couple of hundred nodes. That's the system, and those nodes can be in a 0 state or a 1 state. That's all that can go on. That's all that completely describes this system. And yet we have these other objects appearing that can be treated as if they are as real as the nodes in which we started off, in which is the only real reality of the system, is those original nodes or grid points. We can also see that, remember, time is going forward here. If we take the alpha particle here, it has different phases. It oscillates through 4 different states as it goes forward in time, but it always comes back to, its first state and cycles through it endlessly. So, we have an alpha particle here that seems to have a life or an existence which is independent of the underlying nodes or grid, and it can be almost treated as if it is real in the same sense that the underlying grid is real. One thing that's interesting with this is that the process that we did to filter from the original full description of the system to this view is not reversible. So we have lost information in this. So we have applied our transducer to remove a certain pattern from the background. We've applied a filtering. We've come up with some new entities, quasi objects that seem to have their own set of rules, or chemistry, we're sort of inferring here. But at the same time, this is not a lossless process. We have lost something by applying that rule, clearing out the pattern, because we can't go back again. So not only have we abstracted away from reality, we've thrown some stuff away, we've lost some physics, but the prize for doing that is we've now got chemistry. And this is, you can imagine if instead of having to process each square throughout time, which is a lot of effort, I could now represent this with a much simpler model. It's simpler in the sense that it's computationally simpler. I've got more objects and I've got some rules, but to generate this plot from this high level abstraction is easier than processing it for every single square. So we've been rewarded with an easier way to model this system, but we've thrown away information along the way. So how is our knowledge connected to reality? I mean, what is the relationship between the simple objects that that describe the system that have only two states, 0 and 1, and these quasi objects, alpha, beta, and gamma? I mean, is the relationship between these two? And there is no simple answer to this. Um, the alpha, beta, and gamma could not possibly have been predicted from the basic microphysics. And the only way to have found them is, firstly, we had to simulate the system. We had to run it. There was no shortcut. We had to determine a basis, a pattern basis that we could then invent a transducer to remove it, which, i.e., filter it. And then we started seeing things that looked like real things, and then we started doing some science with those things. But they don't exist at that lower level at all. So, when you start thinking about the relationship between reality and the models we make of reality, the models are never in terms of reality. We've always taken a step away from reality in order to come up with something that we can talk about, do maths on, do simulations on. So we've gained that ability, but we've also thrown away an awful lot of reality or physics to enable that step to happen. And so whatever we end up with is inescapably limited in its applicability and its ability to tell us about how the real world is going to work. Um, I don't know. Some of you may have come across this before. This is something called the game of life. And if I just add the rules here, this is similar to our first case here, where instead of a row that described all the states of the system, now we've got a grid. And instead of that simple rule of physics, which tells you what your two neighbors each side, how they determine your next state. Now we have, you have 8 neighbors all around you, and we have 3 rules here that tell you about in the next time step, this is what your state will be. Again, incredibly trivial. Here are the rules here. I'm not going to read through them. You can look at these yourselves. But again, incredibly trivial rules. All they do is at the grid level is tell you what state each grid element is going to be in the next step. From a network perspective, each node has 8 incoming connections, and that's it. And these 3 simple rules. Now, I'll start playing the video here and talk a little bit while it plays. As you'll see, as the video, it's first going to tell you what the rules are. But I'm going to start off by, a guy, William Poundstone, said of this game of life, which was invented by a mathematician called Conway, that the universe that this rule set creates is not fundamentally any less rich than our own. So, I mean, that's saying a lot. This is saying that these simple rules on a very simple grid can generate a universe that is no less rich than the one we actually live in. I mean, this is incredible. I mean, if this was carried across to theories of everything in physics, then the basic physics of everything will be nothing more than some simple rules applied on a background grid, and that would generate everything we see in the universe. I mean, it's just astonishing. Whether knowing that will enables you to make any predictions is another question altogether. I don't think it does. But just the fact that all of reality could be the result of a simple iterative equation is quite astonishing. And recursion and iteration are probably the most efficient ways of generating interesting things. So as we see here, we got the video playing now. So I mean, this for me really gets to the heart of complexity, emergent properties, and our relationship between the things that we see and we model and the real world. Remember, all of this grid, this is just a grid. applying these three simple rules, and yet we have objects emerging that seem to have an existence of their own. In this case, it's fairly simple to see them. I mean, we can just, where's this coming from? Um, there are certain configurations that when these three rules work together, conspired with an incredible number of feedback loops, lead to these structures. And as this video goes on, the YouTube video, it's showing configurations that people have found in the life world that are stable, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger. I mean, here, we're starting to see things that look like cellular activity. Again, that's not in those three rules. There's nothing in these three rules that tells you about cellular behavior, or even reproduction, or even the ability for machines to create other machines. None of that is in these rules. And yet, this is what we get. And even though this is all operating on a very small grid, there are phenomena in this world that when you start working at this level, the level away from the grid, you can come up with rules that seem even probabilistic. It seems probably the behavior seems probabilistic in nature, and it's like, well, how could that possibly be? This is a 100% deterministic system. We just have a grid and we apply these rules. That's all that's going on here. It's totally 100% deterministic, and yet we have probabilistic behavior. We have it's not all shown in this particular diagram, but we have self reproducing entities. It's not too big a stretch to imagine, if this grid was big enough and it was run for long enough, that you might even see objects that appear in it that look like they're sentient, look like they're making decisions, look like they're making decisions in their interests. I mean, it's but but I mean, this is the incredible thing. It's still just a grid of noughts and ones and a simple set of rules. Um, so again, this is the big question: is what is the relationship between these entities that we see here and the grid from which they emerge? And I think that's one of the most interesting questions that comes out of this work. And what it also shows is that um, without having knowledge, if we only have knowledge of these emergent structures, um, we're only ever going to have a limited understanding of the full system. These that we've had to step so far away from reality to even see these. You can imagine how big this grid would have to be to stand back far enough to see, large entities, that look like they're sentient. I mean, you'd have to stand a long, long, long way away. So your ontological distance, as it were, from the underlying reality would be an incredible distance. And then we get to see these things. And we get to build science of these things through observation. But can we say these things are real? I don't think we can. We can say they are sufficiently real for our science and our tools to generate rules that enable us to interact in them in with certain degree of confidence. But those models are always throwing an awful lot of physics away, an awful lot of the real world away, and to enable you to build those models. They are deeply and inherently limited in their applicability. So, I mean, this is something, if this is something I've kind of spent a lot of time doing, is just watching this game of life and seeing how far, seeing how, see the different patterns in there. There are still patterns being discovered today, even though this has been known for, I think it's 50 years now. It really is incredible. So, I feel like I'm kind of skipping to this bit a bit quick. That there's still so much more to discuss, but what are some practical implications we can draw from this process of filtering out parts of the world to recognize certain objects that we can then do science on? I mean, this is the process we do when we do science. So what can we say about that? Well, one thing I think we can say fairly strongly is that all the perspectives and theories and frameworks that we use need to be regarded as limited, provisional, and subject to change. And I mean, for experienced modelers and scientists, this is like, yeah, sure, that's common sense, isn't it? But it's surprising how much we're still taught to use models and tools as if they were, almost perfect, as if they were guaranteed to give you useful information, as if they were accurate representations of the reality they're trying to model. I mean, that's so many things, so many tools and models are presented as if they are that good, and we very quickly, we tend to overlook the fact that they are normally pretty terrible. They have limited value. They give you limited predictions, and if you stuck by those predictions themselves, you would quickly find yourself in trouble, or the world would be evolving in a way that you didn't foresee whatsoever. So it's a very distinct shift in attitude towards our knowledge and our models. You immediately have to become less trusting of them and be more critical of them and be more careful in how you apply the knowledge you think you've garnered by applying those models and theories. So obviously, it follows quite naturally from this. Don't be too quick to hang your hat on one particular approach. You'll quickly be disappointed. Or even just an attitude, even a modeling process. If we make it a little bit more meta, there's no one right way to do this. And the more complex problems we look at, the more it demands us to be multi-methodological in our approach, to be always on the lookout for the cracks in the model, always to be incredibly humble about the knowledge we think we have about the system that we've modeled or worked so hard to understand. And follows on from this as well. Critical exploration of ideas is essential. Now, I just this doesn't go down the rabbit hole of science is just some other opinion and anybody's opinion is perfectly valid. We don't go down that kind of a nihilist postmodernist view. This isn't where this goes. This is not leading to a kind of philosophical radical relativism. It's not everything goes. All it's saying is that most views, when utilized in a critical way, have the capability of shedding some light on the behavior of the world. And science is clearly better than an opinion. It's not even. I hate it when it's aligned with just being an opinion. It's the result of millions of human hours trying to understand problems and converging on certain ideas. But at the same time, at the very heart of science is an acknowledgement that it's probably wrong, and needs and we don't want to get too hung up on science itself as being the only way to see things or even being correct. Another thing that I found this interesting when in the operational analysis days with the government in the UK is that there's a tendency to think, well, I got this tool and it worked really well last time we looked at this sort of problem. So, surely this is the right way to do it again. Well, even ancient Greeks knew that you couldn't step in the same river twice. Things change, and things in the complex systems world might look like they've changed very small, whereas underneath the differences could be radical. Just just because it looks the same doesn't mean that the underlying causality that resulted to that same looking state was the same as it was before, and it could proceed very differently from there on forward. So, again, it's really highlighting that just because something works doesn't mean it will always work. And what do we mean by work anyway? I mean, is it going to give us knowledge that is actionable? And again, following on from this, what we have done, whatever we do to understand a system will undoubtedly have to change. The system does not ever evolve in the way we think it's going to evolve. Otherwise, predicting the future would be trivial, and it never is, and nobody's ever done it well. And our knowledge we have today, some of a good percentage of it, I think some have said within 5 years, 20% of it of science is wrong. I don't think it's quite that high, but obviously a lot of things we think we know turn out to be wrong in the sense that they weren't perfectly correct, but at the time it was good enough to help us do something, even if the outcome was not necessarily ideal. So be on the lookout for evidence that your current approach is failing. So, especially when, think about policy of any sort, just because you come up with something that seems to be helping things, just the application of policy changes the system. So not only was the policy not complete in the first place, the application of it's going to change the system in ways you cannot predict. So it's going to go wrong at some point. It's going to lose its applicability. It's going to lose its jurisdiction. It's going to start failing. And actively reviewing what we think we know to stay ahead of the curve is crucial when we're talking about complex systems. So again, think about the circumstances under which your assumptions are valid. Understand that it's a legal term. Understand their jurisdiction. If you think about Newton, F equals ma. What an amazing result. I mean, it works perfectly, pretty much, or it works very well at sub-relativistic velocities. So, the jurisdiction of Newton is very much in the non-relativistic realm. You still have tricky difficulties there because we're dealing with non-perfect spheres and all that sort of thing. But the outside of relativistic domain, it's just plain wrong. It doesn't work anymore. So we've got to be a lot better at understanding the jurisdiction of our ideas, where they are useful, where they are flawed, where they are just downright useless. And I think even though people that have been doing this sort of work for numbers of years come to recognize that, I think all too often we're taught to have a lot more confidence in what we think there is than is justified. And that's reflected in how policy is developed, how modeling is used, and so forth. So again, all statements of truth come with caveats. There's nothing is true, even except this statement. I always find it's pretty easy to deal with most paradoxes just by simply adding another line to the end of it, which reigns in its jurisdiction or defines its jurisdiction. The paradox goes away. Um, but and this was a line from an old friend of mine, who's Jack Cohen, who was a world-renowned reproductive biologist who also got into complexity theory. He was a good friend with Douglas Adams, and he wrote this book saying, "Stop work, start thinking." And it was really a cry for, we've got all these tools and we think we know what we're doing, but we really don't. So slow down a bit and start thinking a bit harder about the tools you're using. Start thinking about what the limitations are. Start thinking about, when you start developing policy, for example, how are you going to include the processes that monitor the success of that policy, and how are you going to evolve it when you see that it's now losing its applicability? Soon as you start recognizing that whatever approach you take is limited, a whole load of other uh, things come to bear on it, rather than just like, hey, yeah, no, we've come up with this, let's apply it, let's move on, we're done. It's all very neat and tidy if you can do that. So I just want to finish. I've gone on a bit longer than I wanted to, but I just want to finish with some quotes here that I've always found useful. So this is one from Feyerabend, who was he wrote a book, very interesting book called Against Methodology, which in some ways some people have interpreted it as methodology is so biased it's useless. But I think it's more better used as more of a warning. So for this particular quote, we have abstractions remove the particulars that distinguish an object from another, together with some general properties. Experiments further remove or try to remove the links that tie every process to its surroundings. They create an artificial and somewhat impoverished environment and explore its peculiarities. So, this is referencing right back to the Boolean cellular automata experiment we did earlier on in the presentation. There we've we've applied filtering. We've manipulated the data to end up with something we could do some science with. We have taken it out of its environment to do some science. And even though it was less obvious in the Boolean network example, um, we said earlier, by doing that, you lose stuff, you lose information, you lose physics, you lose science, you lose part of reality. So you're taking a step away from reality in order to model it, which is unavoidable. But let's not forget that the process we went through to be able to do that is very problematic. In both cases, things are being taken away or blocked off from the totality that surrounds us. Interestingly enough, the remains are called real, which means they are regarded as more important than the totality itself. And again, back to the Boolean network example, we're applying these filters and saying, we found these objects. These objects are real. They're more real than the background noise that they seem to have come from. Whereas it's really the other way around. They're less real than the basic than the totality of itself. But by taking that step, we can do some science and we can make some decisions and we can hopefully interact with the world in a way where we can achieve certain outcomes, albeit in a limited way. I always like this quote from Buddhism. I read a paper a long time ago called "The De-Reification of Boundaries." It was a paper on Buddhist philosophy, and I think it really hit the mark for me. So concepts are inadequate to convey the essence of enlightenment, yet concepts are still essential. That is, concepts are both inadequate and essential. Recognizing that all phenomena are interconnected, no philosophical position can be taken without being refutable. No philosophical position can be supported without question and without bias. No ultimate certainty exists. This leaves us with one option, emptiness, which we cannot even call emptiness without error. Emptiness is the unifying basis of all philosophies and an ultimate ground that all philosophies share. So again, this is in some ways shows you what happens when you try and make generalizations about everything. So this idea of emptiness, saying we have nothing, is not saying we can't have something that is useful at the local level. It's saying that as a whole, if we take the whole universe in its entirety, there's nothing we can do or nothing we can say about it which is completely true and irrefutable. So this is happening at a very global generalized level. And I think what I like about it is this gives you a predisposition to how you interact with the world. You go into a problem assuming you know nothing about it whatsoever. It does not mean that you can't then negotiate with reality and come up with a tool, a position, and a theory that has some limited value. All it's saying is that as a good starting point, emptiness is a pretty good place to start. Even if you don't start with emptiness, you need to recognize that the place you start from is bias, and you need to be prepared to move away from that position if need be. It's a very humbling position. So this is coming from another direction completely. A guy called Hofstadter wrote the book Le Shabbat, which if you hadn't read, you should. Referencing back earlier in the presentation where we talked about the relationship between the cellular automata physics and this higher level, chemistry that we find, and the idea that this was a step away from reality and there was loss. in the process. We had to throw stuff away to be able to take that step. Um, and we could never explain the chemistry that we saw in terms of the underlying physics that defines that system. And in Gödel Buck, Hofstadter says a bootstrap from simple molecules to entire cells is almost beyond one's power to imagine. And this is, I think this is a statement that's kind of underestimated. I mean, I think lots of people would argue that chemistry is just physics in action, and that's all it really is, which I would tend to agree with. But that doesn't mean you're going to derive chemistry from physics. We have to step away from the underlying physics and start treating um, molecules and cells as if they had some kind of separate reality, a separate existence, and develop science on those terms and not on the terms of superstrings or quarks or basic atoms. The two are clearly related. One emerges from the other, but that doesn't mean we can explain the higher of one in terms of the other. It doesn't enable us to come up with a theory of everything that will explain everything. A theory of everything will explain next to nothing. And I always like to find a good quote that comes from physicists, because some of the conclusions here may seem like it's kind of having a dig at, at, at at hard sciences, and that's not the intention at all. I think science is still the best way to make sense of a lot of problems, but it's not the only way of doing it. And experienced scientists and physicists know this very much so. Even though often science is presented in the media as kind of definitive, most practitioners are well aware that it's not. And this is a quote from a famous physicist, Louis de Broglie, who said, "May it not be universally true that the concepts produced by the human mind, when formulated in a slightly vague form, are roughly valid for reality, but that, when extreme precision is aimed at, they become ideal forms whose real content tends to vanish away." And I think this is crucial. I mean, the models we have are rough approximations, and they do very, very well, and some of the best ones deserve the respect that they get. They are, some of them are amazing in what the predictions they can do. I mean, the standard model is fairly astonishing. But if you really persist, if you really dig down and go, is reality this? Is this exactly how things work? You quickly find that, well, no, it doesn't. These are not global universal truths. These are terrible to good approximations of the underlying reality. They are reasonable approximations of what actually there is. And if you really try and push those models too hard, you realize that no, they're not very good at all. And that we should be a lot more careful in the status we give some of them. So so we have a range here, these quotes from philosophy to religion to hardcore physics, that all pretty much say the same thing, which is our understanding of the world around us. The relationship between reality and our understanding of it is highly problematic. What I also find interesting is that complex systems and nonlinear dynamics theory provides almost a hard science way to 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 make the same sorts of claims. We almost have science telling us that science is deeply flawed, and its relationship with reality is complex. Um, you know, we've kind of known these things in various areas, throughout human evolution, from philosophy and religion. But now we have science pretty much saying the same thing. The nice thing about science is that it also provides tools to try and overcome these limitations in a way. I mean, it doesn't overcome them completely, but once you recognize this as a problem, um, we can develop tools to help mitigate these restrictions. We can develop processes to help us recognize when our thinking has drifted, our relationship is between our thinking and reality has drifted too far to be useful anymore. Once science gets in in the equation, uh, we can start doing some positive things rather than just throwing our hands in the air and saying, yeah, it's all empty, it's all too complicated. We just have to ride along and hope things work out for the best. Now we can do better than that, but the problem will never go away. Anyway, I'll stop there and hope this was useful to some.